Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Eleonora Mattiacci. I am an assistant professor of political science at Amherst College. Today I'm here with Erin Lin, author of the book When the Bombs Stopped. The book was published in 2024 by Princeton University Press in their Studies in International History and Politics series. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the pod.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I am an associate professor of political science at Ohio State University. Regionally, my focus is Cambodia. In terms of my topic of interest, I study the legacy of war, in particular the Vietnam War and the impacts of bombing on contemporary development. My work is very interdisciplinary. I collaborate with computer scientists, and we've created AI algorithms that detect bomb craters from satellite images to estimate the location of unexploded ordnance. I also work across campus with soil scientists at OSU. We work in minefields and identify heavy metal contaminants that come from chemical leakage from the unexploded ordnance, as well as some of the detonation practices used in demining. And then within the discipline of political science, I have work on the legacy of unexploded ordnance, which is the book that we'll talk about today. But I also have work on genocide, the Khmer Rouge genocide, and the legacy of mass male killings on female political representation and gender norms today. And that's actually one of my favorite articles that I've written that I think a lot of people don't know about.
Those are very important topics. And why did you decide to write this book?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I wrote this book in the last 3 years of my tenure track position. And the reason why I say that is that the timing, I think, is really important. I was far enough away from graduate school where I kind of felt like I was coming into my own. I remember I have these very vivid memories of being a graduate student where you're in this really tight social network. It seems like there are very specific formulas to success. You see models of the best dissertations. You see the job talks coming in and the people who are getting the offers. And those are kind of like the immediate pathways in front of you. And I think a lot of them kind of converge in the same directions. There was something that was very liberating for me to move to Ohio. I've never lived in the Midwest before. I befriended people who cared very little about my accomplishments in my career. And I think it was one of the first times in a long time that my closest friends weren't in academia. So some of that was the timing of where I was in the tenure track. The other thing that happened was the pandemic. So when I started working the book in earnest, life felt much more simplified than it did before. My life was, much less social. I lived by myself. And so I remember just in most of my time, I was reading a lot. And I was reading a lot of contemporary literary fiction, which is something I never did as a high schooler or a college student. So sorry, liberal arts education. But I think it was one of those moments that I loved. I loved what I was reading. It's the scene building, the description, the writing was something that I hadn't encountered before. I felt like my first few years as a political scientist, I was mostly focused on turning my job market paper into a publication, and it was hard. And I made my writing really efficient when I converted that to an AJPS article. But what I was reading in these books, it was writing that was engaging and powerful and moving. And so all of these things kind of came together, and there's something that almost feels both exhilarating and liberating in your last few years of your tenure track position, because you're my time here is short. This essentially is more dedicated time I will ever have in my life to doing whatever important writing task is in front of me. And I realized I just wanted to write a book that combined the things that I kind of just love, feel a strong passion for. So that was Cambodia. I had been to the country for, at that point, probably 8 times over the course of 12 years. And I just, found the people, the culture, the history fascinating and important to write about. I still love political science. I think the theories are fascinating. I love the efforts to answer big questions. I love the multiple types of methodology. And then I have this new passion, which is I love powerful, engaging writing. And so, the long way around to answer your question, it was this time in which I just felt free to write the book that I wanted to exist in the world, like the book that I wish I could have picked up as an undergraduate. Yeah, that's why I wrote this book that, in I think my heart of hearts, I just wanted to marry my favorite political science theories, the methods that I find so useful and yet, hard to use perfectly. But also just with experiences of people on the ground. And that's the whole narrative.
That's exactly what comes through. It is powerful and engaging writing, and it shows that you went the extra mile to make this an enjoyable book. Thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for saying that.
You start the book recounting one of your meetings with the Pen family in Cambodia. You tell us how they engaged in behaviors that may seem puzzling to an external observer. What are those behaviors? Set the scene for us.
Yeah. So I start the book by describing the Penn family farmhouse and how it sits in the middle of this former battlefield in Ratchanakiri province in the northeast of Cambodia at the Vietnam border. One of the first things that you see when you see their farmhouse is that it sits on acres of daikrahom, which is red soil, and that is some of the most fertile agricultural soil that exists in the country. And all of that is just visible from the vista that you're perched at from their house. The kind of two farmers at the kind of central anecdote, that's Loman Liang Pan. They're both experienced farmers, so she can identify, they're a couple, and she can identify wild boar by their tracks, and he's built an entire tractor apparatus from spare parts. And I kind of see how very close to the household they have this really beautiful garden and small orchard, and the plants in that orchard, they're just thriving. Now, the puzzling thing is that, despite their ability to farm well, to know their land, they had years of experience. This couple, they're only able to produce a pound of rice per year, and that changes depending on luck. So it leads to this kind of immediate question of why are these farmers who are so smart and hardworking and they occupy some of the country's richest farmland, why are they struggling so much as they try to kind of enter commercial agricultural production? And in the end, I talk more about the book how a lot of their agricultural land is left fallow. And so there's this question of why do they abandon so much of their land? I answer this question by looking into the political history of that land, in particular, a local event in the past 50 years that still stands out in the family's memory. And that is the arrival of US bomber jets during the Vietnam War. So Liang Pan tells me that from 1970 to 1973, the U.S. dropped bombs all over this area, from the nearby Elephant Hill, and then throughout much of the basin where the farm sits right now. And that's kind of the beginning where, Liang tells me oh, you should go down over there because there's a bomb crater that's as big as our house. But of course, his wife, I remember this, visibly nervous, kind of sweating profusely, being oh, I'll take you to see it, but follow me, don't stray off the path. And the issue was that she was worried I would encounter unexploded bombs if I didn't know exactly where to put my feet. And the problem is that a lot of them are hidden or, even feet below the surface. And that means that she wasn't even aware of all of them. And that's the anecdote that inspires this whole book, this idea that 50 years after the Vietnam War, where the bombing and the immediate explosions already tore a hole in Cambodian society, there's something about this bombing that still continues to rupture lives today. And I point to how unexploded bombs really become these crucial roadblocks to economic recovery. that leaves thousands of rural residents out of land and threatens to push so many more out of the local labor force entirely.
When you talk about Cambodians like the Pan family, you say that they face a choice between quote, requesting professional demining services or keeping bombs in their land, end quote. Why would they want to keep those undetonated bombs in their land?
There's a central irony here, which is that you do have efforts by international organizations and by the Cambodian government to clear ordnance, right? But the issue that comes up in my fieldwork is that when residents are kind of emerging out of, from these 50 years of living in haphazard explosions from the unexploded ordnance, you would think that, things would be able to go back to normal, and they'd be able to farm as they would like in a safe area. But the issue that I find is that farmers are actually now finding themselves in competition with Cambodian elites and their business interests for their land. Um, so only 14% of the land in Cambodia has been properly registered as owned, and the judicial system is controlled by the ruling party. So the political economy of Cambodia is really one that just belongs to the powerful who can undermine the rule of law and use the country's weak property rights to their advantage. This means that, like, if smallholder farmers resist having their land taken, they're subject to evictions and even imprisonment. And like, this is the central paradox that I'm highlighting, like the central paradox of demining, which is that when you remove bombs and all of like the suffering and fear and anguish that they cause, you are throwing people out of the frying pan and into the fire, like into the hands of this kleptocratic government. And that's why in the book I say that like unexploded ordnance is not an unmixed evil. There are terrible immediate things that are associated with the unexploded bombs, but they also serve to protect the people from the kleptocratic government of Cambodia.
It was very striking to read that how these bombs are not an unmixed evil in the book. Now, how would current accounts explain the lives of the Pan family?
When you go back to some of the really important pieces of the legacy of political violence, particularly written by development economists, there are like focal studies of World War II, so post-war World War II Germany and Japan, that highlight how they expect and they find like no long-term impact of World War II bombing on those countries' macroeconomic development. Um, Now, historians like Tony Judt have pointed out that, like in World War II, a lot of bombs, particularly bombs dropped over Europe, were just bad at hitting industrial targets. Malcolm Gladwell actually has a popular history book about where he writes this anecdote of like, imagine the task of the World War II bombardier, where like you're sitting in the plane, you're doing calculus, like in a moving plane, trying to factor altitude, wind conditions, the weight of the bomb, and then you see your target, which is the size of a postage stamp, and your job is to tell exactly when someone is supposed to push the bomb out of the cargo. Like it is kind of crazy that's how bombs were used back in the day. And later, Tony Judt had written that most of the factory damage that occurred in the German auto industry occurred from post-war looting and less about damage from aerial bombing. There's also a very important piece of the legacy of the Vietnam War on Vietnam, and that's by Ted Miguel and Gerald Roland. And they show that at the district level, the bombing during the Vietnam War has not led to increased amounts of poverty, has not really led to any type of like growth trap that you would expect from theories that predict that bombing has a terrible effect on human capital, human development, as well as economic capital. I talk a little bit more about in the book the importance of trying to figure out what the actual theoretical unit of analysis is, especially as we shift from macroeconomic indicators to microeconomic indicators, and thinking particularly about how bombing affects people at the individual level. And that's one reason why I think it was so important for me to collect data that really allowed me to identify the placement of each payload drop that was used from declassified records from the U.S. Air Force, as well as farm level data on production rates today, so I can identify or estimate the amount of historical bombing and thus unexploded ordnance damage onto farmers today. So I find in the end, the argument or the literature review suggests how, macroeconomic indicators from the previous World War II studies can often belie what is happening at the microeconomic level. And this requires more granular data that I was luckily able to find during my fieldwork.
I don't think that's just like, I think that a lot of hard work went into that, and it certainly transpires from the book. So you told us the data you went after. You told us what current accounts would predict. Tell us what you argue instead in the book.
Well, the book reveals this reversal of fortune that takes place on Cambodia's most fertile land. I find that where a bomb's trigger fuse fails, these bombs were designed to go off on impact. But the issue is that these impact fuses fail to go off when they hit soft ground cover. In Southeast Asia, that means the verdant rice paddies, the areas that tend to grow rice all year long and are often covered. They're inundated rice paddies in the wet season. They're covered with pools of water. And it's these most fertile areas where unexploded ordnance tend to cluster. As a result, I find that for all different types of people, from village chiefs of highland tribes to urban migrants from Phnom Penh to former soldiers who fled the Khmer Rouge, they all describe this sphere of fear that hangs over communities when someone discovers unexploded ordnance, when someone accidentally sets off a bomb, oftentimes because these trigger fuses are responsive to changes in pressure or temperature. Bombs can just detonate at random times, or animals can also set them off. So it's, plenty of stories about cows grazing, walking over a place they shouldn't be walking over and exploding. And all of this combines together to lead economic growth to stall out in some of the most fertile areas of Cambodia.
Wow. How is the book organized?
I wrote 5 chapters. I think narratively, the book moves from personal anecdotes to political and ends with kind of a more global perspective. The intro paints the picture for you. I talk about the Penn family, what life is like as a Cambodian farmer, kind of explain the importance of this on-the-ground Cambodia-centric perspective of bombing, particularly vis-a-vis the way bombing has been discussed in literatures and international relations. So how bombing is usually thought about more from the perspective of the perpetrators or the great powers who can use bombs to end wars more quickly. That's Bob Pape's argument. The chapter after that, chapter 2, is kind of the crux of the fertility argument, the idea that historical bombing removes the fertility advantage of high fertility land through exposure to unexploded ordnance. And I make this point ethnographically, kind of starting with an anecdote of Venerie Lang, who was able to compare what her land is like because she married onto her current farm, which is some of the best land she's ever lived on in terms of agricultural quality and fertility. But it scared the bejesus out of her because she found unexploded ordnance when she was trying to clear the land to farm it, and compared that to the land where she had grown up in Prey Veng, where her family did experience the American bombing, but They live on an area with much rockier soil, so they didn't experience the unexploded ordnance. And so just having her kind of illustrate this mechanism that I was reading about, I suppose theoretically, from professional deminers, but actually hearing her say it on the ground was quite striking. So I was able to kind of scale up some of those anecdotes, show how what she was saying also operates in other villages, but then use quantitative data to show how this scales up across the entire country. And so that is a chapter that is, I suppose, in terms of data, a lot of that, the quantitative stuff comes from the HAPS article that I had published in 2022. But I also will say that it's much easier to read. Like the chapter 2 is written for, I think, audiences that aren't necessarily political scientists and more for the book clubs of people's parents who are political scientists. I don't know. So if you want to assign something for an undergrad class, pick that chapter. The chapter after that, I visit one multi-ethnic commune because that lives amongst the unexploded ordnance. Because I wanted to understand like the adaptive mindset of residents as they contend with this, psychic weight of everyday struggle. I wrote this in response to, I think, a lot of what I was seeing in the humanitarian aid field, where there's a tendency to paint people who live amongst unexploded ordnance as just pure victims, like nameless victims that are just, stuck due to their structural conditions in life. And I just wanted to dig a little deeper and see, what their experiences were like and write about them in a more nuanced way. So I collected over 40 oral histories from this commune across ethnicity, age, and gender. And, I found a couple of things. Like, first, there's no like fantasy of resilience. It's not like one of those pop documentaries where it's like, against all odds, one person is going to stand up and save the whole commune. There is a lot of tragedy that's just kind of embedded in everyday life. So there are Khmer brothers who remembered like the human remains of that like hung off the branches of one of the local tamarind trees after an indigenous man accidentally detonated a cluster bomb. And they, said like his stomach was hanging from the branches. There was a former Khmer Rouge soldier who like scoffs at the minorities in the villages, saying that like they know nothing about bomb safety and he's the smartest man in the village, when ironically like they're all engaging in very similar practices. And, I talk about a Tempuan, an indigenous elder who still goes out to teach his Khmer neighbors like where to avoid the bombing, because he has, I think, the most personal experience of remembering the individual raids over the village. And so this chapter just kind of complicates the experience of what it's like to live amongst unexploded ordnance. And I really just seek to document like all of the things, like the sense of fearlessness, the unprocessed grief, like still that desire to blame, like, certain residents, and like how these feelings are carried within, the minds of the respondents. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4, I then want to zoom out and examine how like these unexploded bombs interact with the regional predatory economy that I mentioned earlier in the interview, in which like elite land grabs threaten smallholder farmers. So I talk about this particular land law, the 2001 land law that was designed to redistribute land to the poorest, but it's been actually used by political elite to justify their possession of communal land for economic development. And I find that like that's where this odd insurance happens with the unexploded ordnance, where the unexploded bombs ironically protect farmers from falling victim to the land law, because the damaged land is unattractive to speculators. But the problem is that like bombs can't be removed without putting the residents at increased economic risk. So I talk about a few anecdotes in which like once explosive clearance technicians finished their jobs, the residents actually lost their protection against the Cambodian predatory economy and were soon evicted from their land. So that's the third empirical chapter. The last chapter is the conclusion. And, I deal with the classic comparativist questions of like, how does this scale beyond Cambodia? Why should I care about this? Also questions of like, well, these are old weapons. Like now weapons have become much more technologically advanced. So like where is the line in which we really do need to care about unexploded ordnance? I bring in a lot of current events. So I talk about how war refugees from like Syria, Bosnia, Libya, Gaza, Yemen, Ukraine, like their return has been hindered by unexploded ordnance from very recent bombings. Um, and this is despite the development of like more precise weaponry and like real-time satellite monitoring. So I talk a little bit about the history of the development of cluster bombs, where they're still used, why they're still used, how they're still produced by other countries beyond the US. Um, and I think these anecdotes just offer the possibility of tragedy beyond Cambodia, especially given like America's role in manufacturing, developing, producing, selling, and trading these warheads and munitions to American allies, but then also things that we can't control. So how these weapons are copied by other militaries. And it ends by thinking about what our roles are, both as Americans, assuming the reader is American, but also like what our roles are as political scientists, like what we can do with our skill sets and what our responsibilities are to study questions that no one else has an incentive to study.
Yes, well said. Well said. So, as you described the contents of the book, you told us about some empirical chapters that rely on immersive fieldwork. Tell us what immersive fieldwork looks like and why you opted to do it.
What does immersive field work look like? In the least romantic sense, it just means like living in Cambodian villages and letting the time pass away. So in some ways it meant I spent a lot of time just like hanging out in hammocks, gambling, only small amounts of money, but like just hanging out with people, helping them do chores and helping them farm. Um, I think what this looks like when I put my political science hat on, this means that I was triangulating the declassified materials that I had collected, the scholarly sources that I had read, which span, several languages, English, Khmer, but also indigenous languages that are spoken like Jirai and Tempuan. And I wanted to balance this with or triangulate it by talking with people and witnessing their daily lives. I did this partially because, my identity as a political scientist has just been intertwined with my identity as a Cambodianist. Um, the formative experience of, I think the moment of when I knew I was going to be a political scientist, or at least want to think like a political scientist, was in college when I took a course on nationalism. And that was the exact same time in my junior year where I think the minute it kind of clicked was when I was like, oh, it's helpful for me to have concrete applications of these theories to concrete examples. And so that was this time in which I started going to Cambodia, writing all of my research papers about Cambodia and learning a lot about the country. And and uh, and so, yeah, so the immersive fieldwork is built up over time. Like I had spent, a year living in Cambodia on a Fulbright after graduation from college. I spent another year living in Cambodia during graduate school. I even took a year off to live there, work as a field coordinator for the World Bank, and do my dissertation fieldwork. And I found that this approach was very useful for my intellectual development, because I realized I wanted to do something that highlights groups of people who were affected by the bombing and by the Vietnam War, but hadn't necessarily had the spotlight focused on them. And this kind of showed the heterogeneity of the people involved, but also the value of consulting kind of discrete sources of data in tandem at the same time. And I think it just also speaks to my MO as a person and as a political scientist. For me, it's very easy to spend my time as a professor kind of just alone working on a computer. But I think that my favorite parts of my political science career has always involved people. And this is like people all over the spectrum. So, in the field, this means like getting off the tarmac and on the ground, talking to people who usually don't get interviewed. Um, I also realized that this was my comparative advantage as a social scientist. I spent a lot of unnecessary time, probably at the end of graduate school and the beginning of my tenure track career, being really worried that I was going to get scooped. I think this happens a lot when you work with econometric data, where like it's freely available. It's like it's easy enough to find, and then more and more of us have the very similar high level econometric skills, and so it's just kind of like who can write up the paper the quickest. And as you can probably tell by the pacing of my output, like I'm never going to be the quickest one, but I'll figure out something eventually. And then I just realized like, oh, I think I'm the only one like working in this space that has Khmer language abilities and has a deep interest in the country. And I just wanted to let that shine through the work. And so that's one reason why I think the immersive fieldwork is like a focal point and almost like an ideology at some point for the whole book, because I think it both defines my experience, but also defines like who I want to be as a political scientist.
I want to stay on this issue of immersive fieldwork. You spent 1 month with a clearance team. What can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah. So I shadowed a team of humanitarian deminers. The immediate purpose was descriptive. I wanted to learn what a minefield looks like or a battlefield looks like. I write a little bit in that opening anecdote in chapter 4 about how like I imagined it was going to look kind of like these dirt pits with like construction machines, and I was surprised to find how they just look like normal pieces of land that are often just like wild and overgrown. And I also wanted to know what the current tools and technologies were that we use to clear bombs, which are amazingly impressive. Where I talk a little bit more about how there's like these large loops that are carried over the ground. Very similar ones are actually used for archaeological digs to sense like how far down ruins are and what the overall shape of the ruins are. They have two sensors because they can detect different types of materials like plastic versus metals, and they're becoming increasingly robust to reading weight to things that mess up readings in the past. So things like if there are too many salt ions, that messes up readings. And now, luckily, these are essentially computers that can control for those conditions. Fieldwork is always surprising, and like the thing that kind of captures that chapter is this irony that I had mentioned earlier, which is that I was just surprised to learn how, when I was talking to the people, especially people who live on land that had been cleared not immediately, but 1 or 2 or 3 years before, how that process of mine removal can make the less powerful rural Cambodians vulnerable to predation via these new land laws in the country that I was talking about. And that was sad and fascinating, because I think from probably too much of a theoretical and econometric or econ standpoint, like demining kind of offers this tantalizing promise, right? It's the like removal of leftover bombs should reverse the poverty traps that are created by leftover bombs. They should bring about this swift post-conflict recovery because you're just removing this like market impediment. There's, I think as a social scientist, like this theory, I mean, this idea is attractive because it's parsimonious, right? Like you just need like one intervention. You need bomb removal. It can solve multiple problems. It saves lives. It makes work safer. It lifts farmers out of poverty. I think it's even more attractive and more parsimonious in the fact that it's like the same intervention can be applied in multiple contexts. And so it's kind of like, yeah, hand these people Nobel Peace Prizes. I mean, we have deminers around the world training with like the same manuals and using the same techniques and the same equipment. But the argument here is that like if you treat demining as this one size fits all technological solution, It just isn't, it inadequately addresses these complicated political, social, economic problems, because like simple tech-based solutions are just rarely so simple. And these policies that seem really reasonable in theory often fail in practice, especially if the theory ignores politics. So there's just something about being a political scientist where you're like, oh, we should always pay attention to the politics. And what are the politics of Cambodia? Well, they're authoritarian. There's no real opposition parties. It's ruled by a kleptocratic elite, and there's a weak judiciary influenced by the political elite. And that's why I found that like these mine removal programs kind of recalibrate the environmental like milieus in rural Cambodia, because like unexploded ordnance is seen both as a source of fear and protection from these like challenges to customary land rights. So like on the one hand, you have that like demining will improve personal safety and like briefly improve economic prospects. But on the other hand, you have the same endowments that make land economically attractive. Well, it also makes you as a farmer like geopolitically vulnerable. And what I found through the in-depth interviews and the ethnographic observation is that like across a class spectrum, there are just people in limbo. They're competing against like cronies of the state who want to expropriate their land for commercial development. This means that like the demining efforts, like paired with economic growth, has like pushed up the value of land, which seems good. But then it makes land speculation one of the most lucrative businesses in the area. And as my respondents show, like the local authorities abet political elites in transferring land ownership like out of the hands of villagers. They're reclaiming land under the pretext of using it to provide public goods, but then higher level political officials use the legal loopholes to designate that land, that seized land, as their own private property. So unexpectedly, unexploded ordnance provides protection against predation.
Protection against predation. We talked. I want to go back to cluster bombs a little bit. You spend a big part of the book describes sort of the negative long-term consequences of cluster bombs. So why would armies use cluster bombs given these long-term consequences?
So cluster bombs entered the mainstream of military technology during the Vietnam War. And part of this was the difficulty of fighting this new type of terrain. Like, what kinds of weapons can we use to adapt to this type of fighting? So, you have guerrilla-style fighting on jungle terrain. This meant that, like, the heavy, complicated infantry equipment that we used during the World Wars, that was going to be less effective. This means that, like, Air Force weapons systems, like we wanted to kind of test this in the Southeast Asia case, where you have these dense forests. They're camouflaging both the guerrilla enemies as well as their anti-aircraft artillery. This means that it was just difficult to pinpoint the locations of targets, and it limited the Air Force's ability to provide ground support. So what the Air Force needed was a weapon that was destructive enough to wreak damage on multiple targets at once, but then like stealthy enough to be dropped without inviting artillery fire. And this is one reason why in 1963 in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, the lab there was developing the second generation of cluster bombs. This is also known as like the Blue 26Bs. They're nicknamed guavas by the Vietnamese because they were roughly the shape of one of the round guava fruits. And they became the most widely used submunitions of the war. Each bomblet, that's roughly the size of a baseball, and it contained 600 embedded steel fragments designed to launch or go off in all directions. And that's more than twice the capacity of the first generation of cluster bombs. This area coverage was remarkable. So one dispenser of cluster bombs or submunitions could kill or wound people in a 300 by 900 meter space. An entire fighter jet carrying these cluster munitions could cover a space anywhere from like 1 to 15 square kilometers large. Once this particular weapon was developed and tested, it's almost like overnight. Like these new cluster bomb units became like the complete weapon for area denial. So Lloyd Mustin was the vice admiral and also the director of operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he said in this interview, like, once we tested these cluster bombs, the immediate question became like, how many can we make? So this like new model, the Blue 26, I talked a little bit about how the area coverage was amazing, but it was also really cheap. And that's one reason why Lloyd Mustin wanted to use them. So in 1965, like the unit price for one Blue 26B was $1.12. The US government had requested so many to be made that by 1971, the price had dropped all the way down to 21 cents per unit. We used a lot of those bombs, right? So by the end of the war, US forces had dropped about 26 million cluster bomblets on Cambodia, nearly 97 million on Vietnam, and at least 260 million on Laos. And the majority of these bomblets were the Blue 26Bs, the guava bombs. That's 285 million that we dropped total. And so across Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, that meant we were dropping nearly 7 Blue 26Bs for every man, woman, and child across those 3 countries.
The numbers are astounding. Let me ask you, you study the case of Cambodia, and then you just told us that in the conclusions, sort of, you look at sort of other cases as well. So do your conclusions on the long-term effects of unexploded bombs also apply to other cases, would you say?
Unfortunately, yes. In many ways, the U.S. military's arsenal of cluster bombs, it really hasn't changed much since the Vietnam War. I point to the example of Operation Desert Storm. So that was a 6-week-long aerial offensive in the Persian Gulf War. The U.S. and our allied forces dropped about 17 million bomblets from 41,000 cluster munitions. Now, when a lot of historians talk about air power in this aerial campaign, they always it's a success. They attribute that success to the latest military technology. We are using stealth bombers, infrared night bombing equipment, smart bombs with laser guidance system. But a Pentagon report shows that only 10% of munitions dropped from aircraft were actually the precision guided smart bombs. Air battle managers targeted the majority of sites with the less accurate dumb bombs, and cluster munitions comprised of 1/4 of the total bombs dropped on Iraq and Kuwait. It was also a mix of the types of cluster bombs. So, during the Persian Gulf War, the U.S. Air Force dropped over 9 million bomblets from about 17,000 Vietnam War era models of cluster bombs. So, this included the CBU-52B, the CBU-58B, and CBU-71B. We were also developing or dropping MK Rockeyes, which have a 30 to 40% failure rate. And we developed this new type of cluster bomb called the CBU-87. Those contain bomblets that are called Blue 97s. Sorry for all of the jargon, but this is actually the most lethal submunition in the Air Force's arsenal. It's called a combined effects munition, and it was built to replace nearly all of the older models that we used in Southeast Asia. It kind of looks like a spray can, and a single one of these bomblets contains enough explosives and fragmentation metal that it can actually punch through 5 inches of armored plate. So that's enough to penetrate the top armor of any tank. And it's combined effects because it needs to punch through the metal and then it explodes to kill the personnel who are inside that tank. And it's designed to kind of wreak havoc to groups that are on the move, even if they are operating in this armored protective formation. Now, these models, all of them were designed to explode on impact. But these bomblets landed on the soft sand of the Kuwaiti desert and the Iraqi airfields. And so many of these fuses failed. There's a New York Times journalist who also was a explosive ordnance disposal team member for the U.S. Navy, and his name is John Ismay. And he reported that the Blue 97s not only had like this very high dud rate, but they were almost impossible to clean up because either because of an oversight or by design, they had this really nasty feature, which is that when the bomblet was armed, there is no way to disarm it. There's no way to safely remove the fuse or to cut the fuse. So that is one thing. We have been using older cluster bombs, then we've also been developing new ones, and then the new ones are even more lethal and more dangerous than the old ones and still fail at very, very high rates. The other issue at hand is that the foreign defense industry often reverse engineers American military hardware in order to create their own weaponry. So they're building their own weapons based on American models. So, for example, like for decades, the Soviet Union, back when it was the Soviet Union, made cluster bombs and landmines by reverse engineering the American ordnance. In the book, in chapter 2, I had talked a little bit about binary laying, and one of the things that happens in the anecdote is that she discovers this Blue 42, which is a scatterable mine. It's a type of cluster munition. The Soviets made a copy of that, and it's called the Palm 1S. And actually, like they have improved it on generations. So now they're on to the third, the Palm 3. And that is what the Russians recently deployed in Ukraine. It's an improvement on the Palm 1 because it doesn't require the target to like accidentally step on the mine or disturb the tripwires. The Palm 3 has seismic sensors, so it can detect nearby human footsteps, and then it'll trigger and launch like this small explosive warhead that fragments in midair. So it's, again, increased in lethality. Another like famous Soviet copycat of a U.S. design is a copy of what was called the butterfly mine in the U.S. That's a technique called the Blue 43. The Soviets called it the PFM-1. And they made millions of these. So when the Soviets fled Afghanistan in the late 1980s, they left more than a million of these PF-1 mines. They're like small, they're plastic, they're scatterable anti-personnel mines, and they have these kind of green wings that let them flutter to the ground. So they kind of look like seed pods of a maple tree. And that makes them dangerous because I think the children often are curious and pick them up because they look like toys. They're plastic. But then it also is harder to detect because the main material is plastic and not metal, which means that the demining process takes a little bit longer. So as you can see through all of these anecdotes, unexploded ordnance is not only a problem in Cambodia, but it's a problem in most, if not all, post-war countries in the past, at least in the past 20th and 21st century. And that makes the topic deserving of more attention, particularly by political scientists, I think.
The scope is breathtaking, simply breathtaking. We've taken enough of your time. I'll ask you one final question. What are you working on right now?
I have 2 projects. The first one is something that I hope to do at the beginning of my sabbatical, which will be next year. I'm going to Cambodia to collect oral histories of village elders and their memories of the U.S. bombing. The idea is that there has been no kind of comprehensive collection of oral histories of this particular moment in time. It's time sensitive, of course, as a lot of these village elders are getting older, but also from an academic perspective, we as econometricians use the declassified data of the Vietnam War payload drops a lot. And there hasn't been a lot of triangulation of this data onto like what the experiences were like for people like who live within these drop zones and how their experiences might vary by gender, age, ethnicity, and political ideology. So that's something that I'm hoping to document. The next project is about the South Pacific, and I'm particularly interested in the expansion of the American military bases. As the U.S. works to counter Chinese expansion of their own military interest. And I'm curious to see how the expansion of our military bases impacts civilian life on the ground. So I'm currently going to language school this summer to learn Chamorro, which is what they speak in Guam and the Solomon Islands, or sorry, not the Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands. And it'll be the start of a book, I hope.
Well, then we really hope you'll come back and tell us all about it when it's done. Thank you so much for talking to us today. My guest has been Erin Lin, author of the book When the Bombs Stopped. The book was published in 2024 by Princeton University Press in their Studies in International History and Politics series. I'm your host, Eleonora Mattiacci. Until next time.